All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today we are talking about the defensive side of the Falcons trenches, looking at Ade Ogundeji's future potential and where the Falcons still need help in enhancing their defensive front.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So we've spent the last couple of days talking about the offensive line, and today we'll be talking about the defensive line, talking about Addie Ogundeji, Taquan Graham, Jacob Tuioti-Mariner. We'll talk about the future of the Falcons' defensive front and sort of where they need to make further investments, as well as talking about Grady Jarrett's potential beyond this year with the Falcons. But before we get into all of that, I want to introduce myself. You guys know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, formerly covering the Falcons for roughly 15 years over at falcfans.com, RIP, no longer a defunct website at this point in time. But you can still find me on Twitter at FalcFans, writing weekly content over at the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons. And of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen of the day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on all podcast platforms: Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and many more. But of course, now Locked On Falcons is free and available on YouTube as well, where you can watch video of these Locked On Falcons episodes a few hours earlier than the audio version of the podcast. So if you're eager to get my insights into today, the Falcons pass rushers and defensive players up front, like we've discussed the last couple of days with the offensive linemen, you can check that out a few hours early on Thursday night instead of Friday morning like you normally would for the audio version of the podcast. So, we talked about the Falcons offensive line the last couple of days, focusing quite a bit of attention on the young players like Jalen Mayfield and Matt Hennessy and Caleb McGarry, particularly yesterday, and sort of my expectations, my observations from what those guys have performed like so far this year through 5 games, and what my expectations are for several of those players for the next year or two, should they wind up being starters. And if you missed those episodes, in summary, essentially, I don't necessarily consider any of those 3 players yet to be long-term assets as starters in terms of guys that I could necessarily pencil in starting for this team, not just for the next 2 years, but potentially for the next 3 to 5 years. I'm not quite there with those guys, but in particular, Caleb McGarry is probably the guy that I tend to defend a little bit more, in large part due to, I think he doesn't get enough credit for when he has played well, rather than mostly people focusing on when he's played poorly, which is not the case for some of the other younger players. And given the presence of Matt Ryan for at least a foreseeable future here, I think that's a much bigger concern to beef up your interior offensive line, given the style of play that Matt Ryan is, being that pocket quarterback, than necessarily being as concerned with Caleb McGarry as an offensive tackle. And so I tend to put Mayfield and Hennessy, the Falcons left guard and center, respectively, under a little bit more scrutiny for me than I do Caleb McGarry, the Falcons starting right tackle. But given that we've talked so much about the offensive line, let's flip sides to the defensive line and talk about some of the young players like Ade Ogundeji, Taquan Graham, Jacob Tuioti-Mariner as well. And we'll get later in this episode, we'll talk about sort of the future of that position and how much more investments that the Falcons need to potentially make on that position. And we'll talk a little bit about Grady Jarrett's future. But starting things off with Ade Ogundeji, he has been impressive to me. He has been a pleasant surprise for me, given that, my expectations going into the season. I think he's exceeded sort of the initial floor I had for him. I think he's not only shown a little bit more of a technical prowess as a pass rusher than I initially thought he would, but he's also been a much more frequent contributor to special teams, something I did not expect him to have that role. And one of the reasons why I thought he would have a quiet rookie season and be mostly inactive is because I didn't necessarily see him carving out a role on special teams, and thus have no reason for the Falcons to activate him each and every week, but I think he's done a more than capable job when he's gotten those opportunities on special teams as well as on defense. And, the thing with his floor as a pass rusher, one of the reasons why he's impressed me is I think he's been a little bit more technical than I expected. And that was one of the things I observed of Ade Ogundeji at Notre Dame, is that he tended to use a lot more moves than your average typical pass rusher. He wasn't necessarily refined in those moves, but he tried to throw multiple pitches, to use a baseball analogy. He wasn't just a one pitch type of guy, which is what you often find with the college game, where guys are trying to make the jump and they're really good at that one pitch, and then they get to the NFL level and the pitch is not as effective, largely due to the jumping competition, but also because offensive linemen watch film too. And if they know that you basically got one good pitch, they will gear their game plan around stopping that pitch. And generally speaking, the guys that start games in the NFL are generally good. And so they do a pretty good job of stopping that pitch. And then if you don't have any counters or anything to throw alternative to that initial pitch, then you're basically dead in the water as a young pass rusher and purely surviving off of your athleticism. So I like seeing Ade be a little bit more technical, using his length, using his hands to beat some of those blocks. And we've seen flashes of that. But all of that being said, there's always a but. I'm not as high on Ade's potential in his ceiling as I think others at least seem to be. One of the things that was the buzz I saw from multiple people on Monday after the Falcons-Jets game was sort of how well Ade played in that game. And while I think he did play well, going back and watching the film, I didn't, see all the hype, all the hype was about. I think he certainly had a number of positive rushes. I think a number of the Falcons edge rushers had a number of positive rushes. Dante Fowler played well. Jacob Tuioti made a number of plays. What you won't hear people talk about is this was Stephen Means' best game as well. And then the reason for that is because it doesn't necessarily fit the agenda, which is my agenda too, of not having the Falcons feature Stephen Means nearly as much. We'll get more on that later in the episode. But, given some of that buzz that I heard from Ade Ogundeji on Monday, I was kind of expecting, okay, well, I'm popping the film and he's going to be popping all over the film. And that was not necessarily the case. And so what I saw with Ade Ogundeji in terms of, I don't necessarily know if I can really adjust his ceiling. I can certainly adjust his floor up, but that ceiling, it's staying the same. The floor goes up, but the ceiling is roughly the same. And the reason for that is because with Ade Ogundeji's ceiling, while he has that technical ability, I don't necessarily know if the other elements that you're looking for a capable pass rusher, a high-level pass rusher, are there. And those elements are, you're looking at speed, you're looking at power. And those are boxes that Ade Ogundeji didn't really check for me coming out of Notre Dame. And I haven't seen much from him so far in the preseason or during these first 5 games of the regular season that makes me feel like he has checked those boxes. And that was one of the reasons why when we drafted Ade Ogundeji, I was more interested in bulking him up and putting on, 10, 15 pounds of muscle, because I don't know if speed is something that you're really going to enhance at the NFL level. If you don't have the speed coming into the league, you're probably not going to add more speed, although I know Matt Ryan and his speed training makes people believe otherwise. But, in terms of power, that's at least theoretically, that's something that you could add by getting stronger, bigger and stronger. And essentially what I wanted to kind of do with Ade Ogundeji so that he could check one of those additional boxes to really, enhance his potential as a pass rusher was to bulk him up a little bit and essentially make him into the version of Tack McKinley we saw in 2018, affectionately known as Fat Tack. That was a player that could potentially move inside and rush, in addition to providing some juice off the edge, being a guy that can line up in multiple ways across the D-line and be able to create mismatches in that way. And I'm still optimistic about that potential, long-term potential with Ade Ogundeji. And so for me, when I look at him so far this season, I see a lot of promising things, a lot of things I like, but I need to see more. And that's why I want to see more opportunities for him moving forward as a guy that can get more reps. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue today's episode. But again, I really like him right now, still more as a depth guy at this point in time, but certainly I think probably a little bit more valuable a depth guy than I initially expected. Like my expectations going into the season were that you might get 1 or 2 sacks from Ade Ogundeji. You might get like 15, 20, maybe a little bit more pressures from him this upcoming season. But now I think, if he can get those increased reps over these next 11 games, games, we might move that needle up to maybe 3 or 4 sacks and 30 to 35 pressures, which is certainly a promising start. But my concern is I don't know if he's going to necessarily really build off of that if he doesn't necessarily add elements to his game that's going to increase his ceiling. That was kind of what my ceiling was for him, over the course of his career. The player I compared him to was Carl Nassib. And if you look at Carl Nassib's first 5 years in the NFL, Carl Nassib is a little bit bigger. And that's why, I wanted him to bulk up, because Carl Nassib is like 275 and Ogundeji is like 260. But if he had bulked up, like I saw his potential, and you look at Carl Nassib's average production, he would have averaged 4 sacks and 28 pressures over his first 5 years. So like that's kind of where maybe Ade can get this year, but I don't know if he's going to do much more beyond that in future years, just purely off of winning off of technique and whatnot. I think the ceiling for that is a little bit lower if you don't have those sort of physical elements from speed and power to really uplift that. So that's the point I want to make. So a lot of promise from Addie Ogandeji, but need to see more, and hopefully we get to see more opportunities from him moving forward. We'll talk about the opportunities that we'll get to see from Taquan Graham and Jacob Tuioti-Mariner as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get into that, guys, we know that football season is underway and all eyes are now on the gridiron. And as always, BetOnline is your #1 spot for all the pro and college football action this season, with a new updated website and interface and new odds, props, and contests. BetOnline.ag continues to be the #1 source for everything football. Head over to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and use the promo code Locked On, and you'll get a 50% welcome bonus. The odds to win the National League, the Atlanta Braves, are plus 180, which means if you bet $100, you win $180. You also got this weekend Georgia being 22-point favorites at home against Kentucky, with the line moving somewhat in Kentucky's favor because the line opened up with Georgia being 23.5-point favorites at the beginning of the week. But no matter which bet you like, BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports, from football, baseball, boxing, basketball, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait and take advantage of all the amazing offers available at BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. So, I don't have as much to say about Taquan Graham as I did about Ade Ogundeji. I think he's been solid as a rotational piece. He's coming off a Jets performance that was probably his weakest of the year, and that was reflected in his PFF grades. There was a couple of times where he seemed to get pushed around against the run, particularly against double teams. And in the previous weeks, I thought he did a pretty solid job as as a run defender. We're not seeing as much from him as a pass rusher, but that's to be expected given where I thought he was as a very raw but athletic player, but raw pass rusher coming into the league out of Texas. But, I think he's a guy that certainly has proven that he could be a valuable asset in the Falcons rotation because of his ability to play multiple techniques and play with a high motor and all these various things. But I'm curious to see if the Falcons do what we're talking about with Ade Ogundeji, but potentially with Taquan Graham, is bulk him up, because if he's going to be more of that interior guy that's going to take on more double teams like that, and I think there's one path where that's what the Falcons potentially envision for him, playing at that 290, 295 pound range that he was listed at coming out of college is probably not ideal for that. And you would rather see him in that 310, 315 range. It does look like he's a little bit bigger than he was in college, but, I don't know if he's quite that big. And so we might have to get him on the Crystal at 3 a.m. diet in order to bulk him up this offseason. So that's something to keep an eye on. Moving on to Jacob Tuioti-Mariner, he has certainly flashed as a pass rusher. And basically all the plays that Jacob Tuioti-Mariner is making is purely effort sacks. He's not a speed guy. He's not a power guy. He's not really a technical guy. He's just going to win purely with effort. We saw that sack against Philadelphia. We saw that sack again this past week against the Jets. And so we haven't really seen the player that we saw last year in that Raiders game where he really went off in that game. But that's been basically the one game where it looked like, okay, this guy's got some real juice as a pass rusher. And since then, it's just kind of been purely effort and whatnot. So, I don't know if we're going to get much more from Jacob Tuioti-Mariner than what we've seen for the most part over the last couple of years. But certainly that's a player that is a valuable piece in your rotation, and certainly a guy that can contribute on special teams and be a little bit more of that coverage guy that the Falcons have been looking for from a player like Steven Means moving forward. So I think the Falcons have 3 capable young players that can certainly be a part of the rotation, but none of these guys I'm quite looking at as potential starters, or at least long-term starters. Just kind of like, well, we got to put somebody out there in the starting lineup, and maybe we can put one of these guys out there in a pinch. And, that goes to what we're talking about with Steven Means. And one of the things that you've heard me consistently complain about on this podcast over the last couple of weeks is why Stephen Means continues to get such a high amount of workload. Now, one of the complaints I've had is that they have been dropping him in the coverage way too much. Now, thankfully, that has changed over the last couple of weeks. Those first 2 games, Stephen Means averaged 15 snaps in coverage. In the last 3 weeks, it's down to 4. So he's getting 11 less snaps in coverage each week. But while, that's an improvement from Dean Pease and company, he's still not getting a reduction in snaps because those 11 snaps are now being utilized him as a pass rusher. Now, that's good for Stephen Means because that's a better way of utilizing him. But I think the problem is, the first 2 games, he was only rushing the quarterback about 18 times a game. Now he's averaging over the last 3 weeks about 29 times a game. And so that, that's a little bit too much. You would rather those 11 snaps go to players like Ade Ogundeji and Jacob Tuioti-Mariner, just because, this is no slander zone when it comes to Stephen Means. He's a player we like, but at this point in time with his age, given that, this is a contract year, you want to see these young guys get more opportunities moving forward. And you've heard mention of talk about maybe part of the Falcons' plan is not to sort of throw these young guys to the wolves and slowly bring them along over the course of the year. Now we have 11 game stretch where it's now the time to get these guys ready to go. It's been referred to as roughly the length of a college football season for these guys. And so now it's time, okay, now you're going to gear these guys up. So I'm eager to see if the Falcons do that. And if we get to see more of Ogundeji, we get to see more of Taquan Graham, we get to see more of Jacob Tuioti-Mariner moving forward. And that means less reps for Stephen Means, who, again, as I mentioned at the top of the show, is coming off a pretty solid game against the Jets, but certainly not something that we really want to see repeat moving forward, just because we want to see some of those young guys moving forward. But Ogundeji did get his biggest workload to date against the Jets, so that's a positive sign. But I think that's probably more related to Dante Fowler snap count being reduced due to the injury. I think it was a knee injury that he seemed to suffer, because it seemed at some point in the game, based off of the film I watched, he was donning a knee brace that he wasn't sporting at the beginning of the game. So we'll have to monitor that moving forward, or whatever the case may be, because Dante Fowler has been playing reasonably well this season. Got off to a good start against the Jets, and we've seen him make some plays the last couple of weeks against teams like Tampa Bay and the Giants as well. So we kind of need Dante Fowler moving forward, for the remainder of the year. But one wonders what Dante Fowler's long-term potential here is in Atlanta, because the Falcons, when you look at this whole group as a defensive line, it's kind of barren up front. They don't have a ton of talent, and that's going to be something that they're going to have to work on moving forward, and particularly next offseason. That's what we're going to get into as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, which I, again, appreciate you guys for making your first listen of the day. But I have a recommendation for your second listen of the day. That is the Locked On Bulldogs podcast. If you want to catch up with all things Georgia Bulldogs and why that team is poised to make this SEC title run, check out the Locked On Bulldogs hosted by Daniel and Clint. And you can find Locked On Bulldogs free and available on all podcast platforms, as well as on YouTube. So go check out Locked On Bulldogs there. So when we're talking about, Ade Ogundeji adding more power to his game, that probably means getting a little bit more protein in his diet. And the best way that I know to do that is with Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar on the market. Built Bar has several delicious flavors, whether you're a fan of coconut almond like me, or you prefer mint brownie, cookies and cream, cherry barcia, double chocolate, peanut butter brownie, salted caramel. There's something for everyone. And there's also the occasional limited time flavors such as Rocky Road, apple almond crisp, churro puff, strawberry puff. Try them all with a mix box. Built Bars are great because they taste just like a candy bar containing 100% real chocolate. They're soft and easy to chew, but you get none of the guilt of eating a candy bar because Built Bars are healthy too. They're low in sugar, low in calories, high in protein, high in fiber. Go order yourself some today by heading over to the website at built.com. Use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your first order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So we're talking about the Falcons front, and, you have Grady Jarrett moving forward. We've seen a little bit about Marlon Davidson, but we haven't seen enough of Marlon Davidson, given we haven't seen through a year and a half, roughly, or a year and a quarter, I guess you could say, more than 3 healthy games in a row for Marlon Davidson. So hopefully we can get him on the mend so we can see what he has moving forward. But I think, these next 11 games is going to tell us a lot about what the Falcons have from a talent standpoint up front. I think, as I said, JTM, Ogundeji, Taquan Graham, they to me are valuable rotational guys, but they're kind of back in rotational guys. If you're looking for a front, looking at the D linemen, the interior D linemen, the edge rushers, you're looking for an 8-man group that you can have active each and every Sunday that can contribute, in terms of your pass rush and your run defense and whatnot. And right now, you're looking at that 8-man breakdown usually breaks down to like 4 D linemen and 4 edges, right? And so you look at the D line, Grady Jarrett, if you're stacking them 1, 2, 3, 4, in terms of their hierarchy of their value, Grady Jarrett's your 1 at the D line. We're hoping that Marlon Davidson can be that 2. But right now, the best you can say until he gets healthy is he's a 3 at this point in time. And to be honest with you, when you look at when he has performed more like a 4 on a quality D-line rotation. But, hopefully he can rise up to be a 3 in that regard. But let's pencil in Taquan Graham as our 4 and Marlon Davidson as our 3. That means you need a 2, right? You need a running mate. Tyler Davison, while fine, is really like, in New Orleans, he was basically a 4, right? So that kind of tells you, and he's a 2 here in Atlanta. So that kind of tells you what type of talent you need moving forward if you want to improve that group. So hopefully Marlon Davidson can sort of rise up in that regard. But right now, we can't really count on him. As far as the edge rushers go, let's pencil in JTM as a 4. Let's put Ogundeji as a 3 again. Ideally, I think Ogundeji is probably a 4. JTM's probably a 5, if we're being completely honest, because he's more of a special teams guy than a guy that you want playing a ton of snaps on defense. But again, beggars can't be choosers right now, and the Falcons need to see what they have with JTM, and maybe he is a legit 4 or whatever the case may be. But you need a 1 and 2. It's Dante Fowler, even though he's playing well, probably not long for this world. I mean, I don't want to say it like that. He's probably not long for Atlanta, right? So this is probably his final year, just like Tyler Davison. You have a bunch of other guys on sort of cheap 1-year contracts: Jonathan Ballard, Mike Pinnell, Stephen Means, Steven Sinat. All these guys are free agents next year. Some of these guys could return at veteran minimums, but none of those guys, outside of maybe Fowler, are bringing anything to the table that you're not already getting from the Grahams, the Ogundejis, the JTMs, the Marlon Davidsons, etc. So you're just basically they're not being the 2s that you need at D-line. They're not being the 1 or the 2 that you need as an edge rusher. Maybe Fowler is a 2 as an edge rusher, but we're probably not bringing Fowler back. So essentially, as far as I see it, you got your, if you were stacking them 1 through 8, Grady Jarrett's your 1, Marlon Davidson's probably your 5, Ogundeji's your 6, and Taquan Graham and JTM are your 7 and the 8. And so you need a 2, a 3, and a 4. So you need 3 starting caliber defensive linemen for this Falcons front moving forward. And that contrasts to where you are on the offensive side of the ball, the offensive line. Yeah, you have some young players, but you're not feeling like, we could certainly upgrade some of those positions. Let's not diminish that point. But it's not like you need bodies. Like you kind of need bodies in terms of starting caliber players on the defensive line moving forward if this defense is going to improve over the next couple of years. And the Falcons don't have that. And that's where you want to go out there and get those players. And we're at a point now, given how well Matt Ryan has played the last couple of weeks, that maybe we're not having the conversation that I was having, 2 weeks ago, or going into that week 3, the Friday in the week 3 game. Where we were talking about, the potential of the Falcons using their top pick on a quarterback because it's time to, potentially turn the page on Matt Ryan sooner rather than later. Hopefully you're at a point where if Matt Ryan can maintain this for the next 11 weeks, then you're probably punting on taking a quarterback at the top of the first round, especially given, expectations and all indications are that this is a very lackluster quarterback class, that you don't want to be using a first round pick. It's certainly not a top 10 or 15 pick on a quarterback this upcoming year. And so maybe you can wait to day 2 and take someone like Kenny Pickett, out of the University of Pittsburgh, a heck of an institution. If you don't know, I'm a Pitt alum. Maybe you can take a sort of developmental backup that maybe has some long-term potential there to sit behind Matt Ryan. So therefore you can use that top 10, that top 15 pick that the Falcons presumably will probably wind up with, on a pass rusher, particularly an edge rusher. I'm not going to go into some of the candidates or certain guys I'll keep my eyes on, but I don't like getting into the prognostication where guys are going to get picked game. I just, this time of year, I'm all about, let's just talk about the evaluation of the players, not try to project where they're going to get picked, which is why I always, tend to get upset when I see people complaining about mock drafts. I'm like, you're don't worry about where guys are going to get picked until 6 months from now, when you can have an accurate portrait of that. Let's just focus on the evaluation product. But There's a couple of guys I've watched and I like, but we'll get into that later, in the season and before we start talking about those guys. But I want to see what we have right before we really start focusing on the draft. But you're probably going to potentially, ideally, you're going to get an edge or something like that. That guy that can be the one in your edge group, that can be the two to Grady Jarrett's one in your overall 8-man rotation at the top of the draft. But where are you going to get the other two guys? Where are you going to get the other starting D tackle? Where are you going to get the other edge rusher? You're probably can't really rely on getting those guys 1, 2, and 3 in the draft. I mean, you could, but then where does that leave you with the other positions that you need? Where does it leave you with the quarterback, the running back, the wide receiver, the corners, the safeties that you also need to address, linebacker potentially as well? Falcons have so many holes at this point in time. That's why we know that they're at the beginning of their rebuilding process. And so that's where free agency becomes valuable. And how do you spend in free agency? Well, you got to have money, right? And so that means you have to make decisions on certain contracts. Matt Ryan's contract, Jake Matthews' contract, Deion Jones, Calvin Ridley. These are the big contracts that you have to make decisions on. Are you going to restructure these guys? Are you going to trade these guys? Are you going to cut these guys? Right? Are you going to extend these guys? Whatever. And then, of course, we're talking about Grady Jarrett when we're talking about D-line. And, 2022 is the final year of his current contract. So he signed for one more year after this one. But, what are you going to do with Grady Jarrett's contract? Because his cap hit next year is $24 million. And the easiest way to lower that is by extending his contract. But if you extend Grady Jarrett, you're going to pay him a lot of money. Right, the market for a D tackle of Grady Jarrett's caliber, based off of what Leonard Williams signed this past offseason, what DeForest Buckner signed the previous offseason, is $21 million a year. You're approaching Aaron Donald money, because Aaron Donald's making about $22.5 million a year in terms of where you would have to potentially pay Grady Jarrett to extend his contract. And do the Falcons want to do that? I don't know the answer to that. Now, I'm not advocating that the Falcons shouldn't want to do that. I certainly think Grady Jarrett is more than worth the money, given that I expect him to have, in addition to this year, potentially 3 more prime seasons left. So if you give him a 3-year extension, like we saw the Giants do with Leonard Williams, that would work. And that would give you 3 years of having your one, and then you can add your 2 this offseason, potentially a 3 and a 4, and you can then 3 years from now, 4 years from now, then you can move on from Grady Jarrett and replace him with another 1 or whatever the case may be. So it makes perfect sense for the Falcons to keep Grady Jarrett, but do they want to do that? Does this regime want to hand out another big contract if they're so worried about getting out of this cap nightmare? It doesn't make a ton of sense to start handing out some of the most lucrative contracts, which that only speaks to Grady Jarrett, but it also talks about Calvin Ridley moving forward. So that's going to be something that this regime is going to have to answer. And I don't know the answer to that. So, moving forward, we're talking about, with Grady Jarrett and his potential, is the team not only do they not want to spend the money, will they deem Grady Jarrett worth that type of money? Right? Because, I think Grady Jarrett's playing well this year. Him and AJ Terrell, to me, are the sort of 1-2 guy in terms of who's been the standout on defense this year, the 2 guys that you can generally rely on playing at a high level each and every week. But, when you compare Grady Jarrett's first 5 games so far this year and compare them to, the first 5 games and the multitude of games played over the last, 4 or so years, going back to 2017, this is one of the slower starts he's had this year in terms of, his impact as not only a run defender, a pass rusher. And, if he doesn't elevate his game further and get back to the sort of the peak of his production back in 2018, 2019, and parts of 2020, for the remaining 11 games this year, is the team going to feel compelled to say, well, he's not really worth $21 million. Maybe he's worth $18 million, but not necessarily $21 million if we can't get more out of him. And, there's reasons why potentially you're talking about why Grady Jarrett isn't getting off to a fast start. Some of it is probably owed to the fact that there isn't as much talent around him this year as he's had in previous years. And that could be a contributing factor, which is leading the teams double teaming a little bit more. I know ESPN's double team rate is suggesting that he's being doubled more this year than he was last year. I think their numbers put last year at about 57%, this year about 64%, although, that 7% does, seems significant at first, but, I don't know. This is the problem I have with ESPN's metrics, like double team rate and pass rush win rate and run block win rate, because it's not as intuitive as you think. Like, if he's been double teamed on 64% of all his pass rushing snaps this year, that, compared to 57% on all his pass rush snaps last year, that really only averages out to being like one more snap per game where he's getting double teamed. So it's hard for me to put too much stock into numbers like that, which is why I tend to have a beef with ESPN's sort of advanced metrics in that regard, because I don't think these numbers are nearly as significant as they like to make them out to be. When they put them on those graphs and whatnot, they're representing relatively small percentage point differences, and the graphs kind of mislead you into thinking that there are big gaps between some of these guys and some of these percentage points and whatnot, and it's really not. Like if you put it on a normal graph, like they would all be plotted in like a single blob or whatever the case may be. So I don't know. That's a complaint for another day. We complained about Pro Football Focus grades on yesterday. I'm complaining about ESPN pass rush and run block win rate metrics on today's episode. So it's equal opportunity slander for some of these advanced metrics that you see floating out there that people like to throw out there to indicate how good a player is. I think the ESPN ones are a little bit more iffy than the PFF ones, certainly in my eyes. So, we'll see what happens with Grady Jarrett. As I said, I'm not advocating for the Falcons to move on from Grady Jarrett, but they certainly have to think about it, because, I listened to a recent episode of Joe Corey of CBS Sports, who's a former NFL agent. He was talking about some of the defensive players that were getting paid. He didn't mention Grady Jarrett on that episode, so I tweeted at him like, what do you think about the Falcons and Grady Jarrett's potential future? And he basically said, if the Falcons aren't extending him, it makes the most sense to trade him. And that's true. Like, if you're not going to extend him, and pay him that huge ton of money next offseason, then you might as well move on from him and get the draft assets, and then potentially use that to do whatever you do, to get the pass rusher, get multiple pass rushers, to accumulate those draft picks so that you can go and get a quarterback in a draft class where it's worth going and getting a quarterback, or whatever the case may be. So that's something that the Falcons have to think about, and where they eventually fall on that, I have no idea, but certainly it's going to be a topic of conversation as we continue on Locked On Falcons. And that's going to do it, guys, for this week of Locked On Falcons. I appreciate you for checking us out on YouTube in our first week on YouTube, and we'll continue to be 5 days a week on YouTube, and probably posting these the night before they air on the audio, just to drive up traffic to the YouTube so that we can build up our numbers there. So go subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Make sure you leave a comment, good, bad, negative, all the things in between. Give us a thumbs up, just for the heck of it. All these various things that help us on the YouTube algorithm. By all means, you longtime supporters, even if you don't watch us on YouTube, go and just swing by and give us a thumbs up on all the videos, just so you can help, get us in front of more eyeballs. I appreciate you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen of the day, and giving us those thumbs up and giving us those comments and all those various things. But I always have recommendations for your second listen of the day once you stop listening to my dulcet tones here on Locked On Falcons. And of course, got to plug Peacock and Williamson if you want to stay plugged in to all things NFL with all 32 NFL teams. Check out the analysis that you hear from Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson on the Peacock and Williamson podcast, which is, of course, part of Locked On Podcast Network, which means it's free and available on all podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And guys, if you want to provide any feedback that you want from me, of course, leave a comment on the YouTube stuff. But if you just want to send it directly so that no one else can see it, you can send it to me via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can hit me up on the social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, where you can find me under Locked On Falcons. That's going to do it, guys, for us today on Locked On Falcons. I hope you have a great weekend. I hope you enjoy your stress-free, Falcons-free weekend. Go Bulldogs, go Braves, all these various things. Go Rams. We're all supporting the various teams that we're supporting this year. So I hope you guys enjoy your Falcons-free weekend. Have a great one.